Connell now, Liberal MP Tim Wilson and Labor MP Peta Murphy join me now. Thanks both for your time very much today. Let's start on the prospect of China. Tim Wilson, eventually some very widespread support for this motion that Australia certainly helped push in terms of the COVID-19 inquiry. Do you have confidence from what we know about how the Chinese Communist Party has seemingly covered up this crisis so far, they'll genuinely and fully cooperate on this?
Well, my hope is that they do, because it's in everybody's interest. It's in their interest, it's in our interest, it's in the global community's interest. When you've got a crisis and a pandemic as widespread as COVID-19, it's in everybody's interest to establish what went wrong, why it went wrong, what we can learn from the situation, and principally so that we can make sure it doesn't happen again. The objective that the government has gone into this inquiry has been one both with the correct intentions, but focused rightly, not on an exercise of blame, but on making sure we can avoid a future pandemic. And if that requires adjustments inside China, then so be it. If it requires adjustments around the spread of the pandemic amongst other countries, then so be it too.
Peter, your reaction to this? Labor initially was talking about whether the relationship had been managed well. Is this unqualified support for the government's whole process here? Maurice Payne announced what they were going to do. They built the support. They got the support.
It's a really good outcome. There's no doubt about that. And we've been supportive of an inquiry from day one. You heard Penny Wong talking about that early on. And I heard Anthony Albanese say today, you know, when one person dies, we have a coronial inquiry. So 300,000 deaths. Of course, an inquiry is an appropriate thing to do. So it's a really good outcome.
What did you make of Tim Pallas then? Because he's looked at the tariffs that have been slapped on Australian barley, other language about maybe more coming along the way, and he says this is because of the actions of the federal government, Australia's federal government, and he's spoken about vilifying language. Do you agree?
I'm not here to be a commentator on what state parliamentarians, even treasurers, would say. You know, we think that this inquiry is a good thing. It's not true that there are extra tariffs on Australian barley. We want to see all of this be resolved. We're very glad that there's an inquiry, and I just want to be here, like most other people in the federal parliament, to be here for the national interest. And I think if there was less backbenchers who want to be out there running foreign policy from the backbench, then we'd be in a better position. OK, well, hang on. You can't comment on what backbenchers are saying at the federal government and say you're happy to do that and then not have a comment on the Victorian Labor Treasurer. Do you agree with his comments? No, I'm saying I'm a backbencher. I'm not here as a backbencher running the foreign policy for the government. I'm saying that we are really pleased that there is an inquiry. You know, things could have been handled better at the start.
But we've heard
always be handled better. But it is
criticism
a really
from Labor was backbenchers, including George Christensen, Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells, have been outspoken, and that's hurt things. Surely you can also comment on Tim Pallas, the Victorian Labor Treasurer, and what he said, that this is because of the actions of Australia's federal government that have resulted in these tariffs. Do you agree or not?
Tim Pallas can answer for himself, and Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells and George Christensen can answer for themselves, and the federal government can answer for their backbenchers. We're very consistent federal Labor. We've said that there should be an inquiry. I agree with what Tim said about the benefits of such an inquiry, both for what has happened now and for stopping coronavirus and this sort of thing happening again in the future.
Tim, would you put the comments of Tim Pallas and some of your colleagues federally in the basket of unhelpful?
Well, I mean, if you can't even stand up to your own party, how can you expect members of the Labor Party to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party, to be frank? You know, sometimes backbenchers do provide unhelpful opinions, and that goes on all sides. I think the focus everybody's got to have is how to be constructive. But this is not just a backbencher. This is the Victorian Treasurer, Tim Pallas, who's taken a swipe at the federal government when we're trying to appeal to a sense of national unity about our national interest and our international interest. And frankly, his comments are extremely disappointing. And, you know, to her credit, Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching came out and condemned these remarks quite rightly, because they're not helpful and they're not part of a projection of an Australian position internationally. and is giving sanction, frankly, to the CCP and their conduct.
I want to ask you about the property market, Tim Wilson. I know it's something that you keep an eye on. The warning from the property councils, we could be in for a big hit. And they're going off the back of predictions from some of our big four banks, 30%. They're talking about assistance might be needed, in particular on new projects, that there's been a huge drop in people pulling out from contracts, so for, off the plan apartments and so on. Is this something that the federal government has a role in?
Well, of course, housing is principally a responsibility of the states. But of course, it sits against the backdrop of the general economic conditions. And a lot of it, frankly, is speculative. And that's not to dismiss their concerns. I have similar concerns about what impacts the economic conditions are going to have on housing prices, which is the main vehicle that Australians hold their wealth. But we're not going to know that until we see where we are on the other side of the economic crisis that has flown from the health crisis. Obviously, property and building a new property is an important part of the Australian economy as one of the key foundations that keeps people employed and in jobs. But it's also to make sure we have enough housing that's affordable for Australians so they can realise their own version of the great Australian dream.
So perhaps I watch this space. Peter Murphy, what are your thoughts on this?
I think that the last three things that Tim said about there being affordable housing, about people being able to buy into housing and jobs in construction are absolutely essential. And that's why federal Labor's been calling for a housing assistance package. And it is something that is not a state-by-state issue in terms of some are affected and some aren't. They have different, obviously, issues, and different towns, different regions have different issues, but it's a national issue all up. So we should have a national housing assistance package and a housing affordability strategy. You just have to look around the streets of where you live. Certainly my electorate, you can see people who are homeless, who weren't homeless before, and we get calls all of the time from people who are really distressed, who have either lost their job or are struggling with reduced income, reduced hours, increased bills, and don't know how they're going to be able to continue to pay their rent, let alone have that great Australian dream and have an investment. So it's absolutely necessary to have a housing assistance package.
Tim Wilson, Peter Murphy, thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you.
My pleasure.